Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and we will discuss on uh, startup and innovation. This is our 926th episode. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. Eric and Madam Ali Rice. First, I would like to give chance, Mr. Eric, what do you mean by startup and innovation? How innovation work in the startup industry?
Well, a good way to start is how does innovation work anywhere? And innovation is really new ideas, new technology. It's really change. And that change can be a technical change, it can be behavioral change, it can be an operational change. So anything that gets things going, first of all, is resources. If we want to do anything in the world, you need resources, whether that's money or technology or relationships. It really all starts at a core with resources, but resources by themselves don't do very much. For example, we're here live streaming and StreamYard. Um, StreamYard by itself is an innovation because it allows people to live stream and stream in lots of different places when it first came out. But by itself, it doesn't make change unless Dr. Sharif runs a channel to do something. So the second thing is capabilities. What can we do with a resource? And a lot of times we will look at a resource that even exists. So putting a new resource is pretty good for innovation, but a lot of times we'll look at a resource that's existed for a long time and somebody will say, maybe we could use this resource for something else. So for example, when I worked with the government a lot, that's what I did was look and say, industry's been doing this. Why don't we use this for delivering information? Things like, so it's an innovation to use a website for releasing information. It was using chat in a certain coordination was that web services. So a lot of that was just looking for what already existed and being able to use that resource. So we're talking about the fact that, a new capability can be an innovation. However, a resource can be an innovation, a new capability, the ability to use that resources, and then the ability to use those capabilities, to put those resources and what you can do them in new and innovative ways. So one of the ways you're innovating is usually when people get uncomfortable. They usually require a different in behavior or thought. And generally there's a big pushback that says, oh, that's a stupid idea. That'll never work. In fact, some people attribute a quote to Arthur Schopenhauer. I haven't seen any actual validation of it, but it's that all truth goes through three phases. First, it is ridiculed. In other words, that's a stupid idea. It'll never work. Then it is violently opposed. We have to stop it. It's dangerous to, well, of course, that's the way we've done it. And that's what most innovation goes through is cell phones. Well, that's a stupid idea. The sound quality is terrible. No one will use them, and it's too expensive. And look, there's a payphone over there. It's a quarter. No one will use those things. To radiation accidents. We have to stop it. To I've got two cell phones myself, one for home, one for work. Those kind of things. So that process of creating new resources, capabilities, or actions based on those, which then goes into this whole idea of how do you overcome the pushback of, hey, that's new and different, it's scary. And these innovations can be social too, so it doesn't have to be technology. And so part of the innovation often turns out to be how you accept people to take and accept an innovation. The new idea and people push back. It's amazing how much of the marketing is, things like peanut butter. Oh, no, peanut butter, no. Until, of course, here's how you market peanut butter. So a lot of these things that we take for granted that are even in our supermarkets today required huge innovations just in packaging or display or thought or processing just to get people to accept it. I'm going to give you a simple one. Back when people moved into cities, they didn't really account for how do you feed all these people moving to cities, and food wasn't very good. So people were afraid of the food you cook. So one innovation in the fast food was they moved the kitchen out where everybody could see it, so they could see the food being prepared. Simple innovation, move it so people could see it. So that's the other part of innovation, is sometimes you need an innovation to accept, for people to accept the innovation. So brings us back to startups. Startups are either usually people that get very excited over some technology, or they get excited over some problem they want to solve. And they often work together. But again, it doesn't have to be technology that makes an innovation. Things like the Kiva website, where you can loan money in small amounts to people all over the world. Innovation. And of course, micro lending itself, that's a stupid idea. It'll never work. People don't have money. And of course, that's a lot of lending and micro lending going on now. So I guess that's my opening when we think about innovation, is what is it and why are startup companies so good at it? Sometimes they have trouble with the resource part, but often they're really good at creating a resource which is not that cost intensive to get, or they're very good at using a resource that somebody put in and spent a lot of time to go there. But usually they're passionate either about the solution or about the problem, and they're willing to go through and make it work. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. Now I want to give chance, Madam Aliras. What do you mean by innovation in startup industry?
Yeah, well, my idea of innovation is to do things differently. So we're problem solving. So we're counteracting problems that are kind of disseminated in all kinds of fields. And I worked in education and have done for about 30 years. And I think one of the things that that was really recognizable is there was a level of disengagement, particularly in primary schools, because of the world that we live in now. I think children were kind of over visually stimulated, and the way through that we found, and in the UK they set up creative partnerships, which was a new scheme that hit schools across the country, and that was about bringing creative practitioners in so that there was a creative process used, and it was student led. So students got to make their own decisions, did their own research, did their own inquiry, and they used different ways of doing it. And it could have been, it could have been kind of short films or animation, or it could have been prototypes. But essentially they had kind of hands-on experience, and it tended to bring subjects together. So it might have been kind of designing something that involved mathematics and science, but essentially it was a really interesting phase of development. And I think it changed the mindsets of schools, but it wasn't something that was fundable long term, really. So and the other thing that I wanted to mention actually is that some of the top companies, I think this is the most amazing thing about innovation actually, is that the world's largest taxi company owns no vehicles, and that's Uber. The largest accommodation provider owns no real estate, and that's Airbnb. The most popular media provider that creates no content, arguably, was or is Facebook. And the most valuable photo company that sells no cameras, hold on a second, is Instagram. And apparently the fastest growing television network that lays no cables is Netflix as well. So I think one of the things that's really interesting is when people actually manage to rethink their own business model and industry, so they do things differently and kind of facilitate the process so that they can kind of connect everyone together. And I think that's one of the most amazing things that we've got the potential to do now. So there's kind of a local and global reach. So yeah, that's my first views. Sorry.
Thank you. Now I request Mr. Rod, how you want to define innovations, especially for startup, and how we can improve the innovation quality or improve the innovation ability.
Well, when contrasting a startup with a large company, the reason they seem to be able to innovate better is the way they deal with risk. In a large company, risk can be problematic. People are punished for making mistakes, and depending on the age of the company, that punishment can be rather severe. And that means that large companies have trouble innovating because whenever you step out of the norm, you're taking a risk. And if that risk fails, your job, maybe your career is going to go bye-bye. It's not the way it should be done, but it's the way that it often is done. And that's why large companies have a great deal of difficulty innovating. On the other hand, small companies don't understand risk, and so they'll take. I mean, what we see is small companies innovating. We don't see the aggregate of failure that otherwise occurs, and so small companies do innovate, but they also fail at a very high rate, and that's because to a large extent they don't understand risk, which is good when it comes to taking risk, but it's bad in terms of taking reasonable risk, and so you've got this kind of dichotomy between a large company where you go to it and you're not allowed to do anything innovative, not truly, and a small company that's doing everything on the planet, but really doesn't seem to be able to focus or doesn't seem to be able to define what is a good risk or a bad risk, and therefore goes under. And so finding a way to create balance, you need to be able to take risk. I met with the CEO of Ford Motor Company, my one and only meeting with the guy. And he was talking about the fact that at Ford, so for so long, people weren't allowed to take risk. And that's why the cars, for a period of time, particularly during the 80s, kind of sucked. And so his view was, he'd tell everybody, you can go out and take risk is a good thing. Go out and take risk, make changes, do what you feel you need to have to do. But if anybody takes the risks on the F-150, on the Ford pickup truck, and gets it wrong, they're toast. And I kept looking at him going, you can't have a situation where you're saying, take a risk is okay, but on our premier vehicle, on the thing that we sell the most of and generates the most cash, risk there is not going to be acceptable. That kind of mixed message just doesn't work. And the reason I had the last meeting with him, I told him, if that's where you're going to be, you're probably going to end up being fired. Tesla's going to walk all over you. And I got a lot of disagreement in the room, and he's gone now. So in the end, it's a matter of balancing risk. One, if you're a startup, you have to understand what a reasonable risk, really fast, what a reasonable risk is. If you may need to bet the company, you don't need to bet the company every day. And so making sure that you develop adequate reserves, you're not always operating on the bleeding edge of oblivion, is really important. And yet with startups, often their financial controls suck. They're spending way too much money for the amount of money they've captured. And when they go and ask for money, they don't ask for enough. And so you have this problem with startups where they start off underfunded because they didn't ask for enough money. And then number two, they don't manage the money they've got. And so they run out long before they're able to accomplish their goals. So it's really important right out of the gate that you establish financial controls. You truly estimate, and I would suggest uplift the amount of capital you're going to need to go to market, because everybody underestimates this. And so I tend to uplift by at least 50%. And you still have to justify, by the way, if you're asking for money, you have to justify all of this. But an experienced VC or experienced company providing funds, they do understand this dynamic because they've been through it before. And you can get as much trouble when you're asking for money, asking for too little, as you can get asking for too much, actually more asking for too little, because it looks like you lack competence. Particularly on the financial side. So it's important that you understand risk. And risk is important. What's a reasonable risk? What is an unreasonable risk? And if you're in a large company and you're not seeing innovation, consider doing a skunkworks project. A skunkworks project is where you take a group of people, you take them off campus, you put them in a remote location, you relieve them of much of the administrivia that has to occur in a large company, and you focus them on the goal, and then you fund them and let them run. And then you'll see some folks innovate. It may go someplace, it may not, but certainly if you try to do the same thing inside a company, it's not going to go anyplace. So there'll just be too many people that will be telling the team that they can't do something because it's different, because it's not policy, because nobody's ever done it like that before. And the number of voices, and I've worked for some large companies and I've worked for a number of startups. And in large companies, they tend to proliferate people that are really good at telling you can't do what you want to do, and have great arguments for why you can't do it. So So your ability to innovate is really predicated on this risk balance and working in an environment that allows reasonable risk. If you're in an environment that doesn't allow reasonable risk, trying to innovate is suicidal. And if you're in a startup where they don't understand risk, the entire startup is suicidal. So understanding risk when you go in, understanding that your management understands risk and knows how to balance it properly is critical to innovation. And I'll say one more thing about innovation. You don't always have to innovate. If there's something out there that does the job adequately, there's nothing wrong with using it. As you move into the market, innovation can be an ugly term, particularly when you're talking about corporate buyers. Corporate buyers generally don't want to see innovation. They want to see something that's solid. They want to see something they can trust. They don't want to hear, hey, it's new and different and it's really great and you're the first one that gets to test it. That does not float their boats. Because they too are very risk adverse. And so the more innovation you've got, the harder your sales process is going to be, because you've got to be able to convince the buyer that the innovation is good for them. And it's a high threshold to cross over, because you're telling them to trust something in an environment that typically doesn't allow risk that they've never seen work before. And so that becomes problematic. It's often easier to sell a package of things that are well known, well understood, and just haven't been used this way before, than coming up with something that's brand new, very innovative, and nobody's ever seen work before. It may work, but your proof point and your sales thresholds will be very high. So those are my opening comments. I'll now pass over to David.
Rob, I agree with so
So
much.
David,
Rob, I agree with so much of what you said there. One slight amplification there is that, as you talked about innovation, there are actually three types of innovation that you typically see, in particularly out of startups. And you have incremental innovation, you have distinctive innovation, you have breakthrough or disruptive innovation. And with disruptive innovation, I agree 1,000%. That's the hardest one to sell, because you begin to see that it alters processes, it alters legacy products and the people you're selling it to and other things like that. So that is by far the most difficult. Incremental innovation, which is really just taking an existing product or an existing concept, making it faster, cheaper, more feature functionality, is the easiest, but also it's the place that you make the lower amount of money as a startup. But I've seen very successful startups use incremental innovation to their advantage. The place that actually is a good balance between the risk you have with disruptive innovation and I'm just making other products better, the incremental, is what's called distinctive innovation. And distinctive innovation is not the same product, but you're doing something fundamentally a different way, but it's not breakthrough. You're not breaking the system. You're not doing the disruption. And in a classic S-curve looking at innovation, distinctive is what's in the middle, because you have at the top of it, not many, and it's a very slow process for the disruptive innovation. And in the incremental, it's a pretty shallow curve too, because you're just enhancing what's there. But disruptive is really where you see a lot of things. So a good example is if I look at traveling to meetings and things, an advance in the ability to do air travel, ground travel, rail travel, and to do it better is really more of an incremental. If I go and look at what is a distinctive, it might be using video conferencing for meetings, because I'm still having the meeting, but I'm doing it in a different way. And a good breakthrough is what I'm still waiting for today, is I really want to have a distinctive option called to let me teleport to my meetings, beam me up Scotty type of movements towards meetings. And that is truly a disruptive type of approach to meetings. Or the other approach that is disruptive, and I've actually seen some interesting approaches, is holographic meetings, where you're in person, but no one is there in person. You're all holograms interacting with each other. And, we're seeing in the metaverse some attempts to try to use the metaverse for that. But yeah, I think the metaverse is losing steam right now. And you're going to see that pull back a little bit. But those different types of innovation are very important for a startup. And as we've talked before with startups and innovation, the ability to collaborate, to have collaborations at all different levels, is one of the keys to rapid innovation as a startup. You want to collaborate with other peers if you can. You want to go and find experts to collaborate with and try to make them mentors. Rob was talking about General Motors and things. Here in Austin is one of General Motors' 4 innovation labs. And if you can protect your intellectual property, let me underline, protect your intellectual property. It's good to go and talk with people in innovation labs, not necessarily to sell them on your product, but to understand what the needs are, what the care abouts are, and make sure as you're developing your product, your MVP and others, that you understand those care abouts well. And when you're closer to your MVP and you've protected your intellectual property, going into corporations like that, either through an innovation lab, a corporate venturing program, is a great source to get money for your company and to be able to use it. Because if I go into most companies through their corporate venturing arm for funding, they want to be a customer of your product. And so you begin to use that as not only a funding, but a customer approach. And actually, probably in about 15, 20% of the time, if your product is successful and it meets their needs, I've seen many companies acquired by the companies that they went into for corporate venturing money in the past. Do not underestimate looking at customers to help fund you as you bring innovation products to market. Customers are a low threshold funding that does not dilute you from your company. Friends, family, great source of funding. Venture capital is my least favorite source of funding because oftentimes their total objectives are not the same objectives you have as a startup. And some of them are difficult to deal with and will force you to do things that are counter to the where you want the company to go. So those are some of the things as you look at startup and innovation there. Finally, point on this first part is a word of advice to people who are trying to push innovation as startup. The one phrase in a pitch to a funding source, and any of those, is we have no competition. I have seen people thrown out of the rooms when they've used that line to venture capitalists because your client not buying something is competition. Your client looking at you and say, well, that's great, but we use these other things to do it, loses you credibility. There's always competition, even if it's, like I said, not doing anything. So that is one line that should be banned from every startup's vocabulary, is that word, we do not have any competition. So Sharif, that's kind of my opening.
Thank you. Now I request Mr. Eric, like when we develop a startup, that time, especially the country like Bangladesh or many emerging countries, they have a problem with mentoring the startup and supporting the startup ecosystem. Yes, they are investing a lot of money, but knowing the job, how to help this startup is a major challenging thing. So, how you want to advise these different business incubations to help their startup or mentoring their uh, startup?
Well, the first advice is don't be afraid to search and reach out, because there's a lot of people like us here that will answer questions or help. You can't know everything, and all those resources don't have to be local. The big thing, I think, is for startups anywhere is to get the mindset right. And I think Rob hit the nail on the head with that. The first part of that is to within yourself make sure you're building the right culture. One of the main reasons I jumped from a $1 billion software company into a company started with 4 25-year-old kids and an older sales guy was just I got so tired of hearing that's impossible, that's a stupid idea, it can't work. And going into a startup community, nobody said it was possible. Great, go do it. Of course, great idea. But what they said instead was, how are you going to test that? So you come up with an idea. The first thing they said was not that that's stupid. Oh, how are you going to test that? How are you going to find out? So I think that is the number one mindset that any startup anywhere needs to focus on is here's a change in operations and technology, whatever. How are we going to test that? How are we going to find out if we're right? It's kind of like what David said. You can't say, oh, this is going to work for sure. We have no competition. What people really want to know is why do you think that what you're doing is going to work? And how do you intend to test that? The other thing is to keep in mind when you're talking to big organizations that may be able to buy some of those markets that David talked about, is when companies get big, their number one problem or challenge that I've seen is how do you get all the pieces work together? That's incredibly challenging. How do you get purchasing and R&D and funding and production and sales? And how do you get those pieces to work together? And so you need really world-class, smart, intelligent people to make all those pieces work. The problem with that is they tend to think in terms of what's the plan, what's the return, what's the timeline. And so then you're faced with a problem. If you know how to do it, if you know where you want to go and you know how to get there, just like Rob said, yeah, here's a plan to get there. We'll take this, we'll do this, plus or minus. The risks are pretty well defined. But if you don't know how to get there, they often become in that mindset very uncomfortable with that idea. What they will say is, give me a timeline. I was going out to build help a group of people build a world-class emergency operations center. And my company was, why are you going out there? Well, they want to build a world-class operation. Great. How much is it going to cost? When is it? Who's doing it? What's the exact dollars? And they don't know. Well, why don't they know? Because no one's built one before. You can't just look at an example and say, well, that costs this, we'll do that. In other words, because the risk and timelines were not defined, they felt very uncomfortable even addressing that. And in actuality, we did end up building this thing. Our company did very well in the money doing it, but when they wanted to move that to show that in another area, the company again was, well, wait, how do you know? What's a lot better idea, but they don't like that risk. And that happens even when companies that are really good sometimes put these innovation centers like David was talking about, that here's places where you can innovate within that. A lot of times they'll come up with these great innovations and the main organization won't accept it because they go, okay, we want an exact plan for that innovation, when and where and how do we get there? So they don't really realize that innovation is a process of going somewhere where you don't exactly know how to get. Now, when you're dealing with the evolutionary stuff, that's a lot easier because you can say, here it is. So I just kind of went to the extreme case for in developing companies. When you're presenting something to a group of customers, even though they may need it, they may be very resistant to it, and you have to be very careful in the language you use and how you present it to these organizations, because you have to realize they may have a completely the mindset of, well, give me an exact plan or it can't work. Tell me the exact dollars, give me the exact timelines. And so you have to be very careful if you agree to anything to make sure that those expectations are set to say this is a process for the revolutionary stuff. This is a process, and here are our milestones. And most importantly, here's how we know when we're going to move forward or not. If you've Bert Rutan was very good at that. Setting out, here's where we want to go. Here's a series of ways we're going to get there. And when do you move to the next phase? Well, only when you complete the first phase. We're very clear on what that looks like. This is how we know when we're going to move to the next thing. And here's how we decide this doesn't work. So success and failures and milestones, especially when you're dealing with organizations like that, need to be very clear, or else they will just say, well, you're failing, it's not working, you guys don't know what you're talking about. So I guess the two pieces of advice were fill out and search and reach for what you don't know, and ask if people can help you. A lot of times people meet with you for free or to get the initial thing, and if you can get them invest, they might come in for shares and things. So go grab the resources you need from anywhere. If it's local, great. If it's not, don't worry about it. The second thing is, as you're trying to go out and talk to people about that, just be very careful that you get that difference between a creator's mindset and a producer's mindset. It can be quite different, and you need to translate that language. So hopefully that's helpful advice.
Madam Ali, especially if you advise for women entrepreneur, because we have many women in the grassroots level, we are helping these women to improve their quality of innovations, how they can do that.
Well, I think creativity is kind of fundamental. So I think kind of identifying where their skills and strengths lie and how they can apply them in whatever area of expertise they have. So, and I think there's a quote from Sir Ken Robinson, which I love actually, and basically creativity is key, but essentially our education system's quite risk adverse as well. And I think it's crazy that in the education system that we culturally bring children up to fear being wrong, when essentially the way that we learn is through doing, making errors, and so. And I think the thing is, sorry, just lost the quote. So my view is that essentially, so I think it's kind of moving away from standardization and being really narrow, but embracing the breadth of, of creativity really, so, and where it can be applied. And also, because particularly in the UK, we're a culture when we're encouraged to comply and to ask permission as well. And I spent over 10 years working on the West Coast of America, and I love the fact that there was the freedom to just make choice, and there wasn't as much expectation, or I didn't feel as much expectation. So I think that kind of that ability to go beyond what is expected really. So I think that's really important. And then the final one is that that most progress isn't linear and rigid. It's really quite organic. So it's my experience when I graduated, the thing that I could do most is that I could draw, and the ability to create and draw is the thing that took me on this incredible journey that made me realize the creative process was really important to re-engage children that were disengaged. And also it's a great way to encourage people to innovate. So I think the thing is that the not knowing is where the magic space is. And I think the thing is, as a creator, that when we got locked down in 2020, that uncertainty was always my fuel. So it didn't scare me, And I think Deepak Chopra's quote that uncertainty is the most fertile ground for creativity is amazing. And I think that kind of uncertainty, we were never guaranteed anything before 2020, and we still aren't now. So I think it's kind of making the most of opportunity and using your creative skill sets and your emotional intelligence to find out what fits. And even, you know, just try things that you think might work and see what happens. So I think it's that kind of, that confidence to just do things differently is really important to kind of make change. So I think that's where, and children, as you know, if you watch young children, they're not scared by doing things differently. They naturally play and have discovery and inquiry. And the older we get, the less kind of ingenuity there is, or it's kind of dampened down. So I think kind of fostering that ingenuity is really important.
Thank you, Madam Ali Rice. Mr. Rob, if you share a few of your experience from Silicon Valley, because our youth, the community and startup, they have huge interest about Silicon Valley, how they help different startup. We said that many universities also joining our World Talent Economy Forum. So how they can improve their work.
Well, the larger companies in Silicon Valley have programs where they invest in, well, startups, I guess, should be, they're relatively mature startups in most cases, unless somehow the folks came out of the company. That happens quite a bit too. Somebody leaves the company, forms another firm, gets co-funding from the firm they worked at, and then gets other funding sources, builds something, and then goes back to the company, and the company may buy them. It's not that common, but it's not rare either. And often the funding pools these companies have are put to work to invest in technologies that could be disruptive, kind of hedging their bets. And in some cases it's done just to create competition for the internal teams, create the idea that the internal team is competing with an external group, and whoever gets to the goal first will get the money, and the internal team, if they fail, they'll be reassigned or laid off, and then the external team, if they succeed, they get acquired. That is typically the way it goes. But it's a heavy relationship business. That you kind of have to know the folks that are doing that work, so you can get an introduction. There are events that you can go to that will introduce startup companies to protect prospective funding entities, be that VCs or other firms, that happen on a regular cadence in the Valley. And so you can participate in those. NVIDIA, at their annual events, they will have a series of firms come forward and compete for funding in a competition with judges, and the winning company gets something like $200,000 or $250,000 of initial funding. But the relationship that's created opens the door for additional funding on top of that, if the technology looks interesting. A lot of the firms that NVIDIA is funding are firms that are using their technology, not necessarily firms that are disruptive. But it really depends on the company as to what their strategy is for funding startups. Dell, on the other hand, to a large extent, funds companies that are potentially disruptive to Dell, while NVIDIA mostly funds companies that are using NVIDIA's technology creatively. There's nothing wrong with either strategy. Each one serves a particular purpose. One's to advance the NVIDIA strategy is to advance an existing agenda. The Dell strategy is to make sure they aren't blindsided by a technology they didn't anticipate. So one's, you would say, is aggressive, and the other is offensive, I should say, and the other is more defensive in nature. But both can flip between those dynamics. So it's all about relationships, and here it really comes down to who you know, and then how well you can then if you're going to one of these events, how well you can articulate your strategy, how well you can present and sell your idea and product, as to whether you get the funding, because it's to a certain extent there's only a limited pool of money, and a lot of people competing for it. So those that develop the skills that allow them to perform in the various venues, either relationship one-on-one and being able to pitch, or at one of the events, which means pitching in front of an audience and being able to convey an idea in a way that's kind of like a TED Talk. You don't get a ton of time, and the will be the ones that are successful. So being able to have at least having somebody on your team that is charismatic, that can articulate the underlying concepts in a way that a general audience can understand it, or judges can understand it, or finance guys can understand it. That's a good skill to have on the team to make sure that you can make it through these funding rounds.
Mr. David Smith. Yeah.
Let me keep on Rob's path there. There's also very specialized ones of these two. For example, the defense DUF has a pitch competition that is aimed towards products that can help in the armed forces, and they award prizes of money, but even more importantly, they will award mentors to you and champions to you, which is another great approach. You look in healthcare, and Johnson & Johnson actually has innovation centers around the country with individual pitch competitions there with the same type of output, where you'll do a short pitch, and then money can be awarded, but more importantly is the relationships you make. But Rob also talked about the person that you have on staff. It's really difficult. In one of my companies, we were invited to launch a product at demo, and demo is a really neat activity. And I'm pretty comfortable on the stage, but I'll tell you what, being on the stage at demo and having 500 funders sitting in front of you and dissecting every word you're saying is a different experience. So if you are doing a large one like that, I have to say practice, 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 because it's very different than pitching to a group of individual investors, are going and pitching even a VC. The stakes are larger. The environment is so very different, but there's so many places where you as a startup can have opportunities to go and pitch and things. At the International Accelerator, for example, here in Austin, I'm on their investment committee, and every month they review probably 100 different startups applying to be part of the International Accelerator, and to be able to get a foothold in the markets in the United States and some funding out of the United States. Of the 100 or so that apply, probably 5 or 6 I get to see on the investment committee. And we do a video pitch with them coming into it. And again, it's very short, very detailed things we want to hear. So you need to understand what it is, who you're pitching to, what they want to hear, and be able to work through those type of elements. The third thing in funding is, I want to go back to it. Customers are great sources of funding. If you have a product and you're close to your MVP and you need more money to get it over the threshold, finding your 1 or 2 customers that really want your product, who want to shape your product. One of the advantages companies have when they invest in you, as you want them wanting to use your product, most of them expect you to customize the product some more to their unique needs than as a general product. And so it's a balancing act there again, but if it's a great way to get rapidly into revenue and being paid to do part of that. In the companies I've been on the board of and involved with, we've done that a number of times, and it's fairly good money because they have the intense need to want to use your product, and they're more invested in helping you see it succeed because they're betting on you to have them as a customer. So it's really pretty smart money from a startup and innovation approach. Final thing, I'm going to go back to it, And this is the thing we've heard from our Friday sessions on Nikola Tesla. You can protect your information, but you have to take it to market. Many startups love and they're fascinated by their technology. But the two things they don't do well is they don't protect their intellectual property and they don't try to push it into revenue and into a company that can succeed in the commercial marketplace. Because a startup developing the technology and a startup that's selling and moving it into the commercial marketplace oftentimes require different people. Oftentimes they require different leadership. And those are hard decisions to make as a startup. But a startup understanding that oftentimes the case and being able to plan for it will make it a more successful startup in the long run as they transition from being a startup into an ongoing company. And that's the key to startups is you want that transition. You want that ability to go and become a company and not just a startup. So Sharif, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Eric, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, for me, it's always startups are hard. You feel like giving up all the time. I like one of my startup founder friends who said, "I'm doing pretty well now. I only feel like giving up once a day." So I think that startups do a good job of building a culture that embraces failure as a learning opportunity, but setting expectations, keeping the team going long enough is important. So I think that culture and embracing failure and setting expectations is big. The second thing, though, is really continually clarifying and staying true to your vision. It has to be strong, but it also has to be clear. I think Rob brought up of having a charismatic person being able to tell that story behind your vision, but it has to be a clear vision that people get. When the company says that vision, you have to go, I understand that, and it sounds important. It can't be, I don't understand that, or I understand that, but so what? It needs to be a clear and compelling vision that you have to stay true to and focused on and not get distracted, because it's very easy to go all over the place. You don't have a lot of resources. You probably don't have a lot of time. So continually going in a direction, even if that direction changes, you need to be very focused. And the third thing is also what Rob said, which is really about that network. You have to develop a strong network of potential partners, mentors, potential customers. And it's being able to, with that culture and that clear vision, to be able to tell that story over and over in many different ways and through many different people. And if possible, one of the reasons it needs to be clear and compelling is because if you tell that story to somebody else, they'll tell it to somebody else also, and then they'll tell it to somebody else. So that's one reason to have a clear and compelling, concise vision that keeps going. And then you have to be focused on where you want to go as a business and turning that into revenue, and be adaptable and change as you needed to go. And you also need to take care of yourself and your team, because you can't just drive people 24 hours a day for 5 years. You've got to say, all right, for this period of time, maybe 90 days is a good time. But let's say we're going to focus on this, and then all right, take a break. Then so you have to focus on things, as opposed to just say everybody work hard all the time, because you'll burn people out. So getting your culture right, failure is a learning opportunity, getting your vision clear cut, building that network, being adaptable and focused as you turn that into revenue. And remember, you focus on what needs to be done at the right time, and you don't just drive everybody all the time nonstop, because people will burn out and quit and get discouraged.
Madam Alirais, what's your concluding remarks for today?
I still think creativity is really key for innovation. Your network's really important, and don't be afraid to approach people that are doing something similar to what you kind of your ambitions. So I think kind of access to people's kind of there in a way that it never was before. And I think people love to advise people when they're starting out. So never be afraid to kind of approach people, and just kind of, I think, go with your gut too, so that you kind of, because you probably do know where you need to go really. And I think definitely over the years we diversified because of the nature of technology and the way education was going, so it won't always stay the same. So that ability to react and respond and do things differently is really important, but not for the sake of it, just so that so you're continually innovating and keeping up to speed.
So Rob, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, innovating into a startup can be a lot of fun. Some of the most fun I've had is working for startups. It's an amazing environment, but it can also be pretty toxic. And so if you're looking at doing a startup, particularly if you're a woman looking at doing a startup, you need to take your time to understand the dynamics of the company and the protections in place for a new employee, particularly a woman. Otherwise, you're likely going to discover a bunch of behavior that you're going to have a hard time forgetting. Men have an easier path. That's the nature of the beast. It's unfortunate, but it's true. But it still means even if you're a guy, you do need to do your homework. This isn't isn't jumping into the billionaire pool off the bat. You're going to get rich quick. In fact, I would say arguably if you've got people in the company that are all looking for that big payday, or you're looking for a big payday, I wouldn't recommend a startup. The odds against that big payday are pretty high, and that focus on personal wealth can destroy the company because folks move too early. They strip the company of the money, and then everybody points at everybody else as a thief. And I've been through that as well. And that's no fun. The litigation can go on for years, and any money you make gets chewed up by legal fees. Some folks may end up in jail. It's just not a ton of fun. So best is to do your homework, make sure the people you're working with or people you want to be around, that they treat each other pretty well. They've got good financial sense, and as many people as possible, their focus is on making a difference, making the product, doing something interesting, and to a certain extent having fun in the process. But stay away from firms where they're either pitching personal wealth, where it looks like everybody's competing to see who can have the biggest car, the biggest home, or get to be a billionaire first. That's just going to end badly. So my advice is, make sure it's something you want to do. Make sure the people you're going to are people that you want to work with, and make sure your focus is on the right thing, which is building something amazing, not making yourself into the next Elon Musk. That's my advice.
Mr. David Smith, what's your concluding remarks for today?
The culture that Rob talked about is so important, because the culture at a startup is very different than if I had been a career employee at a large corporation like an IBM or a Microsoft or Lockheed Martin or companies like General Motors and like that. Very, very different culture. And you have to be prepared for that. One of the other unique things of a startup is many people wear many different hats, many different skills. And you have to be comfortable with that as well. And the statistics when you look at venture capital funding of startups is out of 10 startups, 1 might succeed well, 2 might be okay, everyone else is going to fail. So your likelihood of success is fairly low, but that you should not use that as a way to take the steps to do it. And the key is really working, understanding what your customers need, looking at how to collaborate, look at relationships, use mentors where you can, And I hate this saying, but it's really true in startups. Fail fast based on your feedback. More companies I've seen fail because they hung on to an approach too long, that if they had pivoted slightly shorter, they would have been much faster to market with a product that would have sold well and had a positive impact. Instead, they failed and they had to shut down the company. They are tough. One of the startups I was associated with as the president and chief architect, the CEO ended up committing suicide because the stress of a startup is just really heavy. And if you cannot handle uncertainty, if you cannot handle the fact of not knowing if you're going to be paid that month or not, startups are really tough, because the reality is, if you look at the founders of most startups, oftentimes they're not paid, and you have to have money to weather the storm until you get out in revenue and start a model like that. But I would encourage everyone on startups. They are exciting. You have an ability to impact others in the world, and that is some of the most exciting things you can do. And again, with our global environment today, with our digitalization everywhere and things, startups are easier and easier to do. With the innovation networks that are in place in standalone, in corporations and universities and government, there's never been so much help out there for trying to help startups succeed. So think of your ideas, think of the unique ways, and decide how you want to do it. I was out on the lake this weekend with multiple friends, and we were sitting in the middle of the lake on this big float, and we came up with a new company idea. And gee, it seemed like a great thing at the time, but it's still one that in my mind I'm still twirling around and seeing if it makes economic viable sense. But at the time, oh, it's a great idea, and let's go start the company right now from our phones out on the boat. But do it. There's so much out there. There's so many unmet needs. You just need to choose one, get your team together, get some funding, and see where you can go. So Sharif, thank you again. This is a fantastic topic and one that can help change the world.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. This is our 926th episode. I request all of our audience, our speaker, please share our content with the government agency, corporation, and academy. And through this process, hopefully we can uplift the emerging economy. Definitely, we will collaborate with the people of developed nations. And with the help of developed nation, we can develop new world. Thank you, Mr. Eric. Thank you, Mr. Rob. Thank you, Mr. David Smith. Thank you, Madam Ali Rice. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.